Welcome to How to Research Financial Instruments for 278 Reviewers. My name is Patrick Shepard. I'm a senior instructor here at the Institute for Ethics and Government. When we're talking about the public financial disclosure system, we have two goals. One is complete reporting, and two is prevention of conflicts of interest. These are both important in the 278 system because these reports are publicly available. So if a citizen is to request a report, we want to make sure it's complete so they can understand it. We also want to make sure that we've resolved any conflicts of interest to prevent any reduction in the public's trust in government. To evaluate whether there are potential conflicts of interest, we need two pieces of information. We need the financial holdings as reported on the form, and we need to understand the duties and responsibilities of the position. A conflict of interest occurs when the duties of a government employee overlap with their financial holdings. So it's important for us to have both pieces of information. If you're new to the process of identifying and preventing potential conflicts of interest, there are many courses in the Institute for Ethics and Government library to help you understand better. Today we're going to be talking about researching particular holdings that are reported on the form. And we're going to use this four-part process. In part one, we're going to ask, what is it? What is the holding that's reported on the form? The second question we're going to look at is it properly reported? Third, we're going to think about whether it creates a possibility for conflict of interest. And fourth, we're going to see if there's an exemption or remedy available to prevent the potential conflict of interest. In order to work through these steps, we're going to need a number of resources. First, we're going to need access to a search engine so we can find out what various holdings are. We're going to need to be familiar with OGE's financial disclosure guide so we can find out if they are accurately reported. We're going to want to be aware of the conflict of interest write-ups that OGE has published because they provide us a template and roadmap for conducting a conflict of interest analysis. We'll also want to be familiar with OGE advisories and laws and regulations. So here are the four assets we're going to look at today, and these are all reported on Part 6 of a 278E. The first one we're going to look at is Duke Energy Company. So here's our process. What is it? Is it properly reported? Does it create a possible conflict? And if it does, is an exemption available? So let's get started. If we do an internet search for Duke Energy Corporation stock, we may receive a result that looks something like this. We find out that it's a publicly traded company, as indicated by its trading on the New York Stock Exchange, and we have some information about the company, that it is an American electric power holding company headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. So that answers the what is it question. Duke Energy is an American energy company. Next, we want to know, is it properly reported? And to do that, we can go to OGE's website. And the first place we'll want to look is in the financial disclosure section of resources for ethics officials. And if we go there and scroll about halfway down the page, we'll find some guidance. And the first document is Public Financial Disclosure Guide. I prefer to use the HTML version. Once we open that guide, we can navigate to Part 6 of the form, Other Assets and Income. Look for the word stock in this list of assets and income. And we come to this page, and it details what we need to include on a 278 in order to properly disclose a stock. We need the name of the company. Stocks are not funds, so they're not accepted investment funds. We need the value of the company. We need the type of any income, and we need to report the amount of any income. So in this case, we saw that Duke Energy had a value of up to $15,000. The type of income was dividends, and the income amount was $200 to $1,000. So we have a properly reported stock. Which brings us to the next part of the process, figuring out if there's a possibility for conflict of interest and thinking about exemptions. For this, we need to go to a different part of OGE's website. We want to look at conflict analysis and resolution under resources for ethics officials. And again, if we scroll about halfway down the page, we get some resources. And the resource we're looking for is analyzing potential conflicts of interest. When we click on that, we get a number of documents that deal with categories of reported holdings. And for this entry, we want to look at conflicts of interest considerations for assets. And once we do that, we get a large PDF, and on page 13, we cover stocks. And you can use this for all sorts of different kinds of assets. I'd encourage you to look at the table of contents. And what this tells us is that stock ownership creates an ownership interest in the company, so that if an employee's government work, or a particular matter to which the employee is assigned, would have a direct and predictable effect on the company's financial interests, we have a potential for conflict of interest. So that's very important to know. The Criminal Conflict of Interest Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 208 says that stock ownership can create a financial conflict of interest. We also have some information here about possible exemptions in 5 CFR 2640. So let's take a look at that. If we look at 2640-202, exemptions for interests in securities, we do have a de minimis exemption for matters involving parties. So those are the kinds of particular matters that produce a conflict of interest through named parties. For example, an investigation or a licensing or litigation. And we have a de minimis threshold for $15,000 for financial interests arising from ownership of publicly traded securities. In this case, we have a public stock holding. We know that it's valued of less than $15,000, so there is an exemption available. If we had an employee who is frequently working on matters that would affect or involve Duke Energy, we may advise them to divest of that holding out of an abundance of caution, so they don't have to monitor the value of the holding to ensure that it stays below $15,000. So for our first entry, we have indicated we've completed all of the steps in the process. We know what the holding is. We know it's properly reported. We understand how stock holdings create potential conflicts of interest. And we know that if we did have a potential conflict, there's an exemption available, but we could also ask the employee to divest out of an abundance of caution. So let's take a look at these next two assets together. We have AGL Energy Limited ADR and Lloyds Bank Group PLC ADR. And then we have a stock ticker symbol, provided it looks like LYG. Let's see what we can find. So our first step is to find out what it is. And if we do an internet search for AGL Energy Limited, we find out that it's an Australian energy company. So it's a foreign energy company. And if we look at Lloyds Bank Group PLC ADR, we find out that it is a British financial institution. It's a financial services company. So that satisfies our first step, finding out what these things are. Though we're going to look at what an ADR is in just a second. So let's find out if they're reported properly. If we go back to the guide and go to Chapter 6, Part 6 of the form, we can look for American Depository Receipt, because those letters ADR indicate that something is an American Depository Receipt. And an American Depository Receipt is basically an investment vehicle that allows American investors to invest in foreign companies without having to go through the regulatory processes to trade on a foreign exchange. So the reporting is very similar to a stock reporting. We need the name of the company. We know that these are shares, so it's not an accepted investment fund. We need the value, the income type, if any, and the amount. And for both of those holdings, we have that information. It's nice to have a stock ticker symbol, but it's not required. And if we can easily figure out what's reported here, that's sufficient to satisfy the reporting requirements. So let's move on to the conflicts analysis and resolution. We can go to that same section and that same document and go to page 2 and look at the entry on American Depository Receipt. And again, we have some indication about how 18 U.S.C. Section 208, the Criminal Conflict of Interest Statute, treats American Depository Receipts. And what we see is that we have a prohibition on participating personally and substantially in any particular matter that the employee knows would have a direct and predictable effect on the issuing company. So essentially our analysis is exactly the same as it was with the stock. That it creates an ownership type interest, and employees are prohibited from participating personally and substantially in particular matters that would affect the company, not just the value of their shares. And again, we have some information about exemptions. And there's an important note here. If we look again at the exemption for interest in securities, we will see again we have available the $15,000 de minimis. And that de minimis again is the aggregate. So if we had more than one company that was affected by a particular matter, we would need to aggregate the value of those interests. But there's something very important here, is that in order for this exemption to apply, the securities must be publicly traded. And not all American depository receipts are publicly traded. So let's take a look at the definition of publicly traded. So publicly traded means it's registered with the SEC pursuant to Section 12 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and listed on a national or regional securities exchange or traded through the NASDAQ. There are two other for other kinds of companies, but this is going to be the operable definition for ADRs. And the thing that we're going to be concerned about is whether or not the ADR is traded on an exchange, a national or regional exchange, which means an American exchange. So let's take another look at the information we have about these companies. We can see that Lloyds Bank Group PLC has an indication that it trades on the New York Stock Exchange. So that means it's going to be publicly traded. And because it's publicly traded, the $15,000 de minimis is available to us. However, AGL Energy Limited indicates it trades on the OTC MKTS, which stands for over-the-counter markets. Over-the-counter securities do not trade on an exchange, so do not meet the definition of publicly traded, so we do not have the $15,000 de minimis exemption available to us. So our conflicts analysis, even though these are both ADRs, suggests that one is eligible for the de minimis exemption for securities and the other is not, by virtue of the way they trade. So this is something you want to be very careful with whenever you see an American depository receipt. And in fact, some stock also trades over the counter. So if you see a stock holding and it indicates it trades over the counter, you want to make note of that because the de minimis exemption is not available in that case either. So we've completed our process. We found out what these American depository receipts are. We determined that they were properly reported. We thought about the conflicts of interest concerns, and we found out that there was an exemption available for the publicly traded of the two, and there is no exemption available for that security that trades over the counter. That brings us to our final entry, Fidelity Select Natural Gas Portfolio. And this looks like it may be a fund or a collection of investments because the filer indicates it's an accepted investment fund with a value of $15,000 to $50,000. So if we are if we do an internet search, we can actually find the Fidelity Select Natural Gas Portfolio, and we have an indication that it's a mutual fund at the top of the screen here. We find out that this is a mutual fund that invests in the natural gas industry. So that helps us to satisfy that first question. What is it? The next thing we want to do is find out if it's properly reported. And here we like to have a description of the fund, an indication that it's an EIF and the value, and any income if there is some. It would be nice if we had the ticker symbol here, but because we were able to find it, we don't need it necessarily. Something we want to be thoughtful of when we're looking at things called portfolio is they're not always mutual funds. Sometimes they're what's called a managed account. And the difference is a managed account isn't an accepted investment fund. In fact, it's not a fund at all. So if we are not able to find this listed as a mutual fund, we'd want to see if it's a managed account and consult the guidance for managed accounts instead. So it looks like we have a pretty well reported mutual fund here. And again, we can look at OGE's guidance about analyzing mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, and unit investment trusts in the conflict of interest write-ups. And these usually create potential conflicts when a particular matter affects one or more holdings of the fund. But we do, again, as we did before, have some exemptions available. So let's find out if we have an exemption available for this natural gas fund. Let's imagine we had an employee who was participating in regulating or investigating the natural gas industry, and we were concerned that such a matter might arise, and we wanted to find out if an exemption was available. Well, the first thing we have to do is determine if it's a diversified fund or a sector fund. And a sector fund is a fund that concentrates its investments in an industry, business, single country other than the United States, or bonds of a single state within the US. And it sounds like this is a sector fund. The natural gas industry seems to be a sector, and a rather narrow one at that. So let's see if we have any exemptions available for interests in sector funds. And indeed we do. Here is some text from 5 CFR 2640. And it says an employee may participate in any particular matter affecting one or more holdings of a sector fund where the affecting holding is not invested in the sector in which the fund concentrates. So if, for example, this fund were investing in the Disney company on a given day because they had some extra money lying around and they put it in Disney. Because it's not in the natural gas sector, that would be exempt per se from coverage under this provision of 2640. But perhaps more importantly, we have an exemption for participation in particular matters affecting one or more holdings of a sector or mutual fund where the disqualifying interest in the matter arises because of ownership, where the aggregate value of funds in the sector does not exceed $50,000. So if this were the only sector fund in the natural gas industry, and the matter was affecting the natural gas industry, we might be able to rely upon the $50,000 de minimis. And when making this determination, we can look at this definition of sector mutual fund or sector unit investment trust. And it means a mutual fund or unit investment trust that concentrates its investments in an industry, business, single country other than the US, or bonds of a single state within the United States. And in this case, we have a stated policy of investing in natural gas, so it looks like this exemption might be available. Again, if our filer had lots of assets in this class or was very close to the de minimis, we may recommend divestiture in an abundance of caution. So again, this is our process. What is it? Is it properly reported? Does it create a possible conflict of interest? And if it does, is an exemption available, or is there a remedy we should implement? And again, we've taken a look at the mutual fund and found the answers to all of these questions. And finally, the resources we want to keep in mind: search engine, financial disclosure guide, conflicts of interest write-up, and of course OGE advisories and laws and regulations. We hope you found this helpful and wish you a very successful financial disclosure season. We look forward to seeing you again next time.